So welcome to Lesson 9, a review on your tissue types. So a question you would have is, what will exactly be on the test? So you will have a rather standard looking test. It won't be multiple choice. It would be a fill in the blank or short answer response. And so let's go over the 4 types of tissue, remembering that we started with epithelial tissue. And so we had squamous, cuboidal, and columnar, and they could be either simple, which would be just a single layer, or stratified, where you have 2 layers. And with columnar, remember that it could be simple, single layer, stratified where there's more than 1 layer, or you also could have what's called pseudostratified, where it looks like nice straight columns, but in between those columns are pieces that are not quite all the way from the top to the bottom, and that would have been your pseudostratified. And you did a lab on those 3. So for questions on your test, you should be expected to be able to give me the 7 different types of epithelial tissue. So it would be simple squamous, stratified squamous, simple cuboidal, stratified cuboidal, simple columnar, stratified columnar, and your pseudo-stratified. And also expect to have at least 3 or 4 pictures from your lab where you had to identify the different types of your epithelial tissue. And I will try to pick the easiest of the slide pictures so that it's very obvious that it's cuboidal or columnar, very, very obvious that it would be simple or stratified. Then our lesson number 7 was on the different types of the remainder of your 4 types of tissue. We did connective, muscular, and nervous tissue. And having said that, we spent like less than a minute on muscular and nervous tissue. So in the nervous tissue, you would only be expected to write down that it's nervous tissue. In the muscular tissue, you would be expected to know smooth, skeletal, and cardiac. And 1 or 2 words about that. For example, the smooth is found on all of the hollow organs. The cardiac is just on the heart tissue, and the skeleton is that muscle that is covering the skeletal bones. And then remember that we had this strange problem with the connective tissue in that you could label it as 4 types, 5 types, or 6 different types. And I told you during lesson 7 that you sort of had your own option as to how you want to label that. So I would have, for example, I would ask, in general, what are the 4 types of, 4 categories of tissue? And you would write down epithelial, connective, muscular, nervous. And then I would probably have some breakout questions asking about where would you find cuboidal cells, or where would you find columnar cells or squamous. And in the connective tissue, I would asking you what are the subcategories of the connective tissue. And that's where you could put down on 1 line loose and dense, cartilage, bone, and blood as examples, or you also could put down loose and adipose along with dense cartilage, bone, and blood. Again, none of those answers are going to be wrong. It's, I think, very difficult for the high school student to understand that you're going to see differences depending on the professor and the textbook, and I'm trying to get you to sort of get your head around that now. And I would like to have at least 1 example of each. So for example, if you wanted to do 2 for 1 with a loose, you could put down adipose, which is fat tissue for fat storage. Dense, your easiest one would be collagen, and that's for support. And maybe an example would be to support mammary glands or your facial skin. And then cartilage, and you could do the hyaline cartilage or called costal cartilage. Hyaline is the type, costal cartilage is the name for it that attaches to the rib cage. Or you could also do, for example, the intervertebral discs, where you have in between the vertebrae helping against pressure. And then bone, you have compact and spongy, bone being compact being the tough outer part of the circular part of your bone, and that is for protection and support, whereas the spongy interior portion of that is where you're going to find your blood. And then your 4th type of connective tissue is blood itself, where you have both erythrocytes and white blood cells and platelets, and that's manufactured inside your bone. So just as a quick review from where we are, you have 4 tissue types, your epithelial, connective tissue, muscular, and nervous. And then the subcategories under that, your squamous, you have simple and stratified, squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. And your connective tissue, depending on how you want to write it out, you have 4, 5, or 6 different types. Loose and dense, a proper connective tissue, that is truly the connective tissue that is thought of as being your tough connecting and supporting component. Your cartilage, that is for sort of a buffer or protective piece. Bone, where blood is manufactured, and a bone really does support the body, and blood that is manufactured within that bone. And blood in itself is very strange in that it's listed under connective tissue, but it does nothing as far as support is concerned. And then you have your muscle tissue, which is smooth, skeletal, or cardiac. The smooth being the muscle that you'll see on any hollow organ, so your intestinal tract, your stomach. So again, liver, kidneys aren't hollow. Then skeletal is that muscle that helps operate your skeletal system. Without your skeletal muscle, you would not be able to move your arm back and forth. And then your cardiac is a very specific tissue that is found in the heart. And then nervous tissue is the last of your 4 categories of connective tissue, not connective tissue, but tissue in itself. So again, on your test, what would I expect? I would expect you to be able to identify, if I have pictures of squamous, cuboidal, or columnar, I would expect you to be able to identify those pictures. I would expect you to be able to also identify very basic types of connective tissue pictures, again, from your lab lesson number 8. Blood and bone are 2 that are very easy to identify. And in muscle and nervous system, I would expect you to be able to list the 3 types of muscle tissue, and I would expect you to be able to identify the difference between smooth and cardiac and skeletal muscles. So all 3 have very definite identifiers to it. So the cardiac tissue, for example, has the intercalated discs, and the smooth and skeletal tissue, each of those have different components to it that you should have learned from your lab activity. And if you have any questions as to what is on your lab component that should have already been turned in, or if you have any questions as to what is going to be on the test, please email or contact me. Again, you will get images from your labs, your 2 labs on epithelial tissue and your lab on the other 3 types of connective tissue, and you should be able to identify those, as well as be able to write out the 4 types, the categories of tissue, but epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscular tissue, and nervous tissue, and then be able to break out from that and tell me that in epithelial you have 2 major categories, simple and stratified, of squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. And in your connective tissue, you have 4, 5, or 6 different groups, depending on how you want to write it out. Loose and dense, proper connective tissue, your cartilage, your bone, and blood. And in your muscle tissue, again, you should be able to write down that there are 3 types. And I will not ask you the types of nervous tissue. Again, if you have any questions at all, please contact me. Thank you.